Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground. Now, if there is one constant in gaming, and especially Nintendo, it's that there will always be a Super Mario game. The Nintendo Entertainment System, right from the start, introduced us to, in particular, the Super Mario Bros. 1, 2 and 3 games, and then the SNES would later bring us Super Mario World and Super Mario All-Stars. But prior to that, the Nintendo Game Boy itself would introduce us to this classic. Welcome to our retro review of Super Mario Land. Now let me paint you a picture. It's 1989, April to be precise, and a young Saber, 9 years old, is unboxing his first games console, the Nintendo Game Boy. And right alongside that present is his first real video game console game, Super Mario Land. I put that cartridge in, I switch on, and from that moment on, I am in love with the Super Mario Bros. Games. That beautiful and heartwarming story is not a unique one, and it's exactly why, when Nintendo released their new handheld console worldwide, they wanted their iconic Nintendo mascot front and center. At this point, Nintendo are following up their initial console, the Famicom or NES, depending on where in the world you sit, with the Nintendo Game Boy. We're about a year away from the release of the SNES, which would absolutely catapult Nintendo as a can't-lose franchise. The Nintendo Game Boy was something completely different. This was the first time we got a real handheld actual console with multiple different games that could be swapped in and out. But the original Nintendo Game Boy was not without its limitations. First of all, its memory and capacity was far below the original Nintendo, certainly far below the soon-to-be released SNES. And, far more importantly, the graphical limitations were there for all to see. A completely green screen, no colour at all. It was going to be difficult to put that vivid, beautiful example of a Mario game that we were used to right there on that teeny tiny screen. Nintendo's response to this was quite clever. They didn't try and make it exactly the same as the Super Mario Bros. Games we were used to. First of all, they called it Super Mario Land. That made it clear this was a kind of an offshoot rather than a direct sequel. It wasn't set in the Mushroom Kingdom. We weren't going to see Bowser. We were going to have Daisy instead of Princess Peach. And there was definitely no Luigi. All in all, this was Mario having a completely different mission. That said, they certainly did put a few familiar faces in, but with their own little spin, all of which was quite clever. The Goombas and Koopa Troopers, which are super famous within the Mario franchise, and it just wouldn't be a Mario game without them, were both in there, but there were limitations. They couldn't animate the Koopa Trooper shells bouncing backward and forward, so instead they thought outside the box and introduced exploding Koopas, so when you jump on them, you better run pretty fast. They also introduced whole new game modes, such as the side-scrolling shoot-'em-up modes with Mario inside of an aeroplane and submarine. These were unique and we hadn't seen them before. It gave Super Mario Land something kinda special. The game itself was, of course, nowhere near as big as Super Mario Bros. Was. In Super Mario Bros. We had 8 worlds with 4 levels in, but an awful lot of repetition within that. The last level of every world was always a castle, with Bowser waiting for you at the end. In this one, the last level of every world was kinda different. Hell, sometimes you were in the aforementioned submarine or aeroplane, and instead of Bowser, you had a completely different end-of-world boss. Each of the levels and worlds also had some quite unique characters thrown in. Yes, we had the Goombas and Koopa Troopers we mentioned before, but we had all kinds of original characters, most of whom we'd never see ever again, giving Super Mario Land its own unique legacy. Another thing they did really well on this was not try too much to copy Super Mario Bros., but unlike Super Mario Bros. 2, not try too much to be completely different. It felt like a Mario game, but but it also felt like a Mario game with its own unique innovations. This was a side-scrolling platformer, familiar enough for Mario fans to enjoy, but original enough for new gamers to pick it up and be at roughly the same level as veterans. But how was the game received when it was released? Was it the rip-roaring successor Nintendo were hoping for? The answer is an undeniable and categorical yes. Super Mario Land was the second best-selling game of the year, not just for the Game Boy, but on any console. The one game that beat it? Can you guess what it was? It was Tetris, the game you got free when you bought the Game Boy. So realistically, Super Mario Land was actually the best-selling game. If you want a bit more context than that, it went on to sell more copies worldwide than Super Mario Bros. 3, the game that was at that point held as the benchmark not just of Super Mario games, but in many ways, games full stop. Super Mario Land surpassed that. The video game magazines of the time gave it scores between 90 to 98%, 90 being a bit of an outlier, and even that is an exceptional score to give a video game, especially one on such a limited console as the Game Boy itself. It was quite rightly described as a shorter, smaller version of Super Mario Bros., and the length of the game was touched on, not exactly as a criticism, but as a fair point to make. However, it was also identified that despite its relatively short length, the game was perfect for pick up and play. It was perfect for portable gaming, and it still had a great deal of secrets for you to discover as you carried on replaying the game. Player 1 would also describe it as the pinnacle of portable video gaming and a masterpiece, but there was one other factor they also commented on, and that was the music. Nintendo knew that they had to keep the music simple and yet catchy. After all, Mario's music has always been a massive part of its games, and for this, it did no less. The music for Super Mario Land has become as iconic as the music for Super Mario Bros., so much so that a few years later it was actually used for a music video in the charts, and Ambassadors of Funk put together this little ditty, which I'll leave you to search on YouTube for yourself. It's awful and fantastic in all the best ways. But with its success at the time clearly established, it's time to ask that all-important question. How does the game stand up to modern scrutiny? Well, despite being a huge lover of this game, I didn't have my original copy. I'd lost it many years ago, so I've only replayed this game quite recently when it was added to the back catalogue on the Nintendo Switch. I will add here that whilst looking back at the scores this game got when it was released, I also saw some retrospective scores, and they all came in around the 70% mark. So that did leave me wondering, how was I going to find the game now? Was it maybe not going to live up to the expectations and the fond memories I had of it? Well, I can happily say that that is not the case at all. Yes, the game is very simplistic, as, well, most of the earlier Mario games were. And it can also be very clearly stated that the game was a lot shorter than most of the Mario games, but it was designed for a handheld. What do you expect? The game wasn't especially easy, and even going back to play it now, having completed it multiple times, the game still offered a fair challenge. Whilst graphically it wasn't quite as beautiful as some of the later Mario games, or earlier Mario games to be fair, the audio was still fantastic, and certain levels, such as this ancient Egyptian classic, were still stunning to explore. I will also say that I was especially excited to get back in that aeroplane and submarine again. Those game modes were so much fun, and something Mario games should definitely consider bringing back. I was also regularly surprised and very pleased to see certain characters that Mario would come up against that we haven't seen in any other Mario games, so yeah, I really enjoyed it. When giving this game a rating, I am very much focusing on it being on a handheld. I know I'm not just focusing on the way consoles were then, I'm looking at it how it is now, but it has to be considered that handhelds recently have been the same level of quality as home consoles. The Nintendo Game Boy back then was never at that level. So for me, Super Mario Land as a handheld portable game definitely deserves an 8 out of 10 even now. Graphically the limitations are clear, but the audio is still fantastic, the gameplay is still absolutely spot on, and there's factors in this game, parts of this game that I enjoy playing more than many modern Mario games even now. Definitely deserves its score, and is still an absolute stone cold classic. But what do you think? Where does Super Mario Land and the Super Mario Land series of games rank for you? Comment below, let me know, and until next time, take the high ground.